There's a specific kind of quiet that only happens after the last person walks out. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind you chose, the kind that rings in your ears like an echo of everything that used to fill the room. You didn't see it coming all at once. It happened the way seasons change. So gradually you barely noticed until one morning you looked around and realized everyone was gone. Some of them left with reasons, some left without a word, and some. The ones you were certain would never leave, those are the ones whose absence still sits heaviest. And here's what nobody talks about. The leaving itself isn't the hardest part. The hardest part is the silence that comes after. That specific, hollow silence that follows you into the kitchen in the morning. That sits across from you at dinner. That waits for you at the end of every day when there's no one left to call. And somewhere inside that silence, a question you didn't ask starts asking itself, was I ever really known? Or was I just convenient? That question is heavier than loneliness, because loneliness just means no one is there. But this is something deeper. I wonder if the people who were there ever truly saw you at all. And if they did, why was leaving so easy? This isn't about blaming them. People leave for 1,000 reasons, and most of those reasons have nothing to do with your worth. But here's what I want you to stay with today. In every room that emptied, something didn't leave. Something quiet, something that doesn't need to announce itself, something that was there long before any of them arrived, and is still here now in the silence they left behind. And maybe, just maybe, that is where we need to look. When someone leaves your life, you don't just lose them. You lose a piece of yourself you didn't even know they were holding. Nobody warned you about that part. You expect the empty texts, the quiet weekends, the plans that no longer exist. What you don't expect is to stand in front of the mirror one morning and not quite recognize the person looking back. Not because here's what's true, and it's harder to say out loud than it sounds. So much of who we think we are gets built inside our relationships. They give us our roles, our rhythms, our reasons to show up a certain way. She was the strong one. He was the dependable one. You were the one who always knew what to say. And then, they're gone, and the role disappears with them. And now you're standing in a version of your life that no longer has a part written for you. That disorientation you're feeling, that I don't even know who I am right now, that isn't a breakdown. That's just what it feels like when the scaffolding comes down. The scaffolding was never supposed to be the structure. Here's where it gets quiet and important. God was watching all of it, not from a distance, not with disappointment. I'm with the patience of someone who has always known something you're only now beginning to see. The people in your life never had the authority to define you. They only had the ability to reflect you. And some reflections, as familiar as they felt, were never fully accurate. There's a verse that hits differently once you've lost someone who felt essential. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Isaiah 43:1. Not called by the name your relationship gave you. Not named by the version of yourself that existed to keep someone else comfortable. Called by name. By the one who authored you before anyone else ever met you. Before the friendships formed. Before the titles. Before you learned which version of yourself made people stay. He already knew what to call you. And every departure in your life, every painful, confusing, one-sided goodbye has never once changed that. When the people who knew your name walk away, you find out whose voice you were actually living by. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe that's the beginning of the most honest thing that's ever happened to you. Because what's coming next isn't about what they took when they left. It's about what they're leaving that finally made room for you to see. What if the people who stayed the longest were never actually the ones who saw you the deepest? That's a hard question to sit with, but stay with it for a moment, because we've been taught to measure loyalty by duration. The longer someone stays, the more it must mean. The more it must be real. The more losing them must be a tragedy. But duration and depth are not the same thing. Some people stayed because you made it easy for them to stay. You adjusted. You accommodated. You quietly folded yourself into a shape that fit their life and called it closeness. Some people stayed because they needed the version of you that existed in that dynamic. The helper, the listener, the one who never asked for too much. And as long as you kept playing that part, the relationship kept running. Some people stayed not because they truly knew you, but because you never gave them a reason to leave, and there's grief in that realization. Real grief, because it doesn't erase the memories. It doesn't mean that nothing was genuine. But it does mean this. The silence they left behind might be the first unmanaged space you've had in years. No performance, no managing perceptions, no quietly editing yourself before you speak. Just you. And whatever has been waiting underneath all of that. God has always been more interested in that version of you than the polished one you showed the room. And here's what's quietly profound about that. He was never fooled by the performance. He never needed you to maintain it. He was simply waiting for the moment the room cleared enough for you to stop. There's a verse that doesn't get read the way it should. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. We turn that into an instruction about patience, about waiting, about sitting quietly until the answer comes. But read it again. Be still. And know. Not be still and strategize. Not be still and figure out your next move. Not be still and rehearse what you'll say when people come back. Just be still. And in the stillness, know. There is a kind of knowing that has nothing to do with information. It's the kind that settles into you when the noise finally stops, when there's no one left to impress, when the only presence in the room is the one who never left. You couldn't have heard it while everyone was still there, not because God wasn't speaking, but because the room was too full of other voices. Some people leaving wasn't the loss you thought it was. It was the clearing. And you cannot see what was always standing in the corner of the room until everything blocking your view finally moves out of the way. The grief is real. Honor it. But don't let it be the only thing you take from this season, because something is becoming visible now that couldn't be seen before. And what God has been quietly waiting to show you, that's exactly where we're going next. What if God didn't fail to keep the people in your life? What if He was the one who let them go? That thought might feel uncomfortable. It might even feel unfair. But stay with it. Because there's a difference between abandonment and intention. And what felt like one might have actually been the other. You wanted the room full. You prayed for it to stay full. And God, who could see everything you couldn't, wanted you to finally see what was actually in it. For not every person who filled your life was filling it with the right thing. Some filled it with noise that felt like connection. Some filled it with a need that felt like intimacy. Some filled it with familiarity that felt like love, but was really just history repeating itself. And you couldn't see any of that clearly while they were still there. Not because you weren't paying attention, but because when you're inside something, you can only see what the light inside it shows you. Sometimes God removes people not because He's punishing you, but because He's the only one in the room who could see what their presence was actually costing you. Think about what a surgeon does. A surgeon doesn't walk into an operating room to cause harm. Every cut is calculated, every removal is intentional, and the patient, in the middle of it, feels nothing but pain. The healing comes later. The understanding comes later. The "I'm glad they did that" comes later. You're not in the middle of a punishment. You might be in the middle of a procedure, and the one performing it hasn't left the room for a single second. There's a line in Deuteronomy that reads differently once you've been through a season of loss. The Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you not, nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:8. Read that slowly. The Lord Himself goes before you. He was already in the next season before you arrived at the end of this one. He saw what was coming. He wasn't caught off guard by a single departure. Everyone who said they wouldn't leave eventually had a reason to. The friend who promised forever found a new life. The partner who said they'd stay couldn't handle staying. The family member who was supposed to be unconditional turned out to have conditions. Every human promise has a breaking point, not always because of malice. Sometimes just because people are human, limited, changing, carrying their own weight. But here's what quietly wrecked everything I thought I knew about this. God never made that promise in words. He just never left. He was there in the morning when you woke up alone and didn't know how to start the day. He was there in the drive home where you finally let yourself cry. He was there in the 2 a.m. quiet when the grief sat on your chest and you didn't have a single person to call. He didn't announce Himself. He didn't ask for credit. He just stayed, the way only someone who was never going anywhere could stay. And that is what God saw that you couldn't see yet. Not just who was leaving, but who was left. And what that presence, quiet, steady, unshaken, is about to show you next is the part of this story that changes everything. How exhausting is it to be known by people who only love the version of you that you carefully constructed for them? Think about that for a second, because most of us have been doing it for so long we don't even notice it anymore. The editing, the filtering, the instinct to read the room before we speak, the quiet calculation of how much honesty is safe here, how much vulnerability is too much, which parts of yourself are acceptable, and which ones need to stay hidden. You didn't do that because you were fake. You did it because you were trying to survive the relationship. And somewhere along the way, surviving the relationship became the relationship. So when those people leave, yes, there's grief. Real, legitimate, sit on the floor grief. But underneath it, if you get quiet enough, there's also something that feels uncomfortably close to relief. Not because you didn't love them, not because it didn't matter, but because you are finally for the first time in a long time, not performing. The audience left, and the show is over. And in that stillness, in that raw, unguarded, nobody is watching quiet, something shifts. You stop being the version of yourself that was built for them, and you start being the version that was there before any of them arrived. That version is the one God has always been looking at. Not the polished version, not the capable version, not the version that had it together enough to be worth staying for. The real one, the unedited one, the one you've been protecting from everyone else's judgment for years. Here's what's sacred about that. God never needed the performance. He wasn't waiting for the version of you that had things figured out. He wasn't holding out for the cleaned up, presentable, socially acceptable edition. He already knew what was underneath it. There's a line in Psalm 139 that hits like a quiet earthquake when you finally hear it in the right season. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. Psalm 139 verse 1. Not, you have watched me and formed an opinion. Not, you have evaluated me and found me acceptable. Not, you have seen my best moments and decided I'm worth something. You know me, the version behind every carefully worded explanation. The version that surfaces at 3 a.m. when there's no one left to perform for. The version you've spent years keeping out of sight because you weren't sure anyone could handle it. God saw that version from the beginning with full clarity, and he didn't flinch. He didn't distance himself. He didn't start re-evaluating whether you were worth staying for. He stayed for that version, for the real one. And here's what that means for you right now in this season. You don't have to earn your way back to being known. You are already fully known by the one who never left. The people who left only ever knew the version you allowed them to see. God saw what you didn't show anyone, the fear underneath the confidence, the doubt underneath the faith, the longing underneath the independence, the tenderness you kept locked up because the room never felt safe enough to bring it out. He saw all of it, and he's still here. Which means the most important relationship in your life doesn't require an explanation, doesn't require a performance, doesn't require you to figure out the right version of yourself to present. It just requires you, exactly as you are in the empty room with nothing left to hide. And that is not the end of something. That is the most honest beginning you've ever had. Here's what I want you to walk away with today. The leaving wasn't the whole story. It was never the whole story. It was just the part that hurt loudest, the part that took up all the air in the room and made it impossible to see anything else. But grief has a way of clearing your vision when it finally passes through. And what's left, once the noise settles and the empty seats stop screaming at you, is something you couldn't have seen while the room was full. A presence that never announced itself, never competed for your attention, never needed you to perform or explain or be anything other than exactly what you are. The people who left took a lot of things with them, but they couldn't take that. You might still be in the middle of the hard part. The forgiveness might not be there yet. The understanding might still be out of reach. And that's okay. You're not behind. You're not failing the process. Healing doesn't move on your timeline. But God has never once been in a hurry, and He's never once been late. What this season is teaching you, slowly, quietly, in ways that don't always feel like teaching, is that being truly known has nothing to do with how many people are in your life. It has everything to do with the one who was there before any of them and is still here after. You were never as alone as it felt, not for a single moment. And the version of you that's emerging from this empty room, that's the one he's been waiting to walk with all along. If this finds you in the right season, stay a little longer. There's more here for you. Subscribe to this channel, because every week, this is the space where we sit with the hard, quiet questions that most people scroll past. Share this with someone who's been carrying an empty room in silence. And if this touched something real in you today, I'll leave one line in the comments, just, "God saw what I couldn't." Not as a declaration, not as a performance, just as something true you finally permitted yourself to say out loud, because you are here, watching this, still standing. That's nothing. That's everything.